Remember when Bayern Munich replaced Julian Nagelsmann with Thomas Tuchel last March because they were worried he wouldn't win the treble, despite still being in all competitions at the time? That decision has backfired, big time. Just look at this stat for context. Nagelsmann only suffered 10 losses in 84 games, while Tuchel already had 10 losses in 43 games. That's shockingly bad for a manager of Tuchel's stature. After suffering a string of 3 consecutive losses, the first time for the club in 9 years, Bayern's title hopes are all but shattered, with Leon Goretzka likening the situation to being trapped in a never-ending horror film. Well, as it's turned out, Tuchel has become the first casualty in the club's efforts to reverse their fortunes, officially announcing that the coach would leave his position at the end of this season. However, one can't help but question the decision to stick with Tuchel, a manager perplexed by the team's challenges and at odds with some of its senior players. Strangely enough, it feels as if the Bayern bosses have only prolonged the club's agony. But how did it come to this? How did Bayern Munich implode under Thomas Tuchel? Tuchel can have no complaints about his imminent exit, but Bayern's problems began even before his arrival last year. Under Nagelsmann, Bayern had just eliminated Mbappe and co in the Champions League round of 16 and were a single point away from first place in the Bundesliga. But all that wasn't enough for the Bayern board, who replaced him with Tuchel in the hope that their new manager could work his magic to beat Pep Guardiola's City and win the Champions League in the process, just as he did with Chelsea 2 years prior. Following Bayern's 4-2 win over Borussia Dortmund in Tuchel's debut match, which also propelled them back to the top of the Bundesliga, there was great anticipation for more success. But that optimism soon faded after some setbacks, including quarterfinal elimination in the DFB Pokal and Champions League. Only by a crazy stroke of luck did Bayern not lose the Bundesliga to Dortmund, who miraculously failed to get 3 points on the last match day to clinch the title that was all but in their hands. Even then, it was clear that something about Tuchel's side was amiss, but the club didn't consider changing the coach again in the summer. Those who were shown the exit door were Kahn and Salihamidzic. The very 2 men who had hired Tuchel, intending to rebuild the squad, were dismissed even before they could join in the title celebrations. Jan-Christian Driesen, a former finance director without football expertise, replaced Kahn as board chairman, but there was no new sporting director in time for the summer window. Instead, a transfer committee of Tuchel, key board members, and a duo of Hoeneß and Rummenigge were set up, with mixed success. Still, Tuchel had all the time in the world to prepare his team for the coming season, which was bolstered with the arrival of Harry Kane to fill the void up front left by Lewandowski 2 seasons before that. But at right back, the squad was left short after Tuchel approved the loaning of academy graduate Josip Stanisic to Leverkusen, just days after Benjamin Pavard left for Inter. That was solely on him, but more pressingly, Tuchel's request for a new defensive midfielder went unheeded. To make room in midfield, he proposed selling either Goretzka or Joshua Kimmich, incidentally the same players who were most critical of the club's decision to fire Nagelsmann, but to no avail. Arsenal-bound Declan Rice was too expensive, and the €60 million price tag for João Palhinha was also initially seen as too dear. And by the time the manager did get his way, the deal fell through at the last second after Fulham's failed attempts to bring in a replacement. So instead, Tuchel had to make do with the very Goretzka-Kimmich combination he had criticized and considered unworkable. Limited influence on squad building is one of the quirks of the Munich job, and in case opinions are divided, the board has always erred on the side of repelling costly upheaval and backing the existing personnel. This has led to a paradox at the club. Bayern want managers with a clearly defined footballing philosophy, but are hesitant to provide them with the means to implement their philosophies on their terms. But where Tuchel differed in comparison to his predecessors, who equally had limited influence over transfers, was that he wasn't willing to accept the hand he was dealt. Throughout last summer and beyond, he kept pushing for a defensive midfielder, openly questioning the credentials of Goretzka, Kimmich, and new signing Konrad Laimer for that role. Since the first 2 were part of the team's leadership, the effect has been destabilizing. Matthias de Ligt also has a tense relationship with Tuchel, whose technical style of coaching has failed to hit any emotional chords with most of his team. At the end of the day, it's the manager's job to get the best out of the players he has, not wish he had different players. But unfortunately for them, Tuchel often ends up shitting on some of the very players he has to rely on. It's nonsensical and a surefire way to underperform on the field. As aptly described by Dortmund chief executive Hans-Joachim Watzke in 2023, Thomas is a difficult person, but a fantastic coach. Right from the start of this season, Bayern struggled domestically, losing the Super Cup to RB Leipzig in August and exiting the DFB Pokal in the second round to 3rd Division Saarbrücken in November. Results were still decent until the 3 consecutive losses that derailed their season. The 3-0 humbling by Leverkusen, the 1-0 loss to Lazio that exposed weaknesses in Tuchel's system, and the 3-2 defeat to Bochum that significantly diminished their chances of winning the Bundesliga. It's a curious case for Bayern. For 11 years running, they have always delivered when it mattered most against whoever were their closest challengers. But their loss to Leverkusen was reminiscent of the 5-2 hammering by Jurgen Klopp's Dortmund in the 2012 DFB Pokal final, the year before their hegemony started. In the league, you would have to go back even further to 2009's 5-1 humiliation to eventual champions Wolfsburg to find a table-topping clash this one-sided in their opponent's favor. Losing happens, even at Bayern Munich. But for a club of their stature, it was the limp nature of those defeats and how little they retaliated that made them particularly unacceptable. Their games this season have often lacked dominance and clarity. Whenever they were able to hit the opponents on the counter, they struggled to create openings, resulting in their offense looking clumsy and sluggish. This is largely a consequence of Tuchel being more concerned with avoiding counterattacks from opponents than with creating numerical advantages at the other end of the pitch. His players have been afraid of losing the ball, knowing that their coach would have a go at them if they tried riskier passes over the top of defenses or through the line. It can't have helped that Tuchel has made no attempt to hide his displeasure on the touchline. Instead of the love and support that some of these players needed, they had a coach who often made dismissive gestures or shook his head in despair. That discord still doesn't quite explain why a coach of his quality couldn't get more out of his players. It could be argued that he adopted a safety-first approach due to the absence of his preferred holding midfielder, a player capable of providing defensive cover like Javi Martinez. But the manager must bear most of the responsibility. Tuchel, not for the first time, put the offensive problems down to the players not beating their men against Leverkusen. One of his guiding tactical ideas, influenced by Pep Guardiola, is to isolate defenders in 1v1s. Since Bayern's players are better than their Bundesliga rivals on paper, that should be a promising strategy, but injuries to Serge Gnabry and Kingsley Coman have reduced the impact on the flanks, while far too many players have struggled with form. Individual talent can only take a team so far, especially for an entire season. Against Leverkusen, Bayern were so incredibly blunt and slow going forward that one was left wondering whether Harry Kane's goals have merely conjured up a mirage of attacking competence at the club until now. Despite his record-breaking season, he's not even receiving the necessary service to fully demonstrate his goal-scoring abilities. Thus, Bayern's sluggishness in attack cannot be solely attributed to missed chances by the team, which would be on them, but rather to the manager's failure to ensure effective ball progression up the pitch and into the opponent's box. The defeat against Leverkusen brought Tuchel comparisons with one of Bayern's iconic predecessors, but not quite in the way he hoped for. To cynics, it was his Guardiola moment, an overly clever yet flawed attempt to do something tactically special in a big match. Deployed for the first time this season, Bayern's unfamiliar 3 at the back setup was designed to mirror Leverkusen's wing-back formation. To deal with the pace of Jeremy Frimpong, he also pitted the right-footed Sacha Boey as left-back, a position he had not played in 4 years. In Tuchel's defense, there is logic in adapting, and there's no way of telling whether Bayern's regular setup would have affected the result. But he could not have known that Xabi Alonso would opt for a different system too, moving away from his wing-back reliant game to a hybrid 4 or 5 at the back with the more defensively minded Stanisic in Frimpong's place. Boey, meanwhile, seemed uncomfortable in his new position all night and looked like a lost puppy when Leverkusen opened the scoring. Going out to negate their opponent's strengths rather than ruthlessly exploit their weaknesses is not how things are traditionally done in Munich. But one of Tuchel's other personnel choices was much harder to justify. Why did he prefer Dayo Upamecano, who just returned from injury, Kim Min-jae, who just returned from the Asian Cup, and Eric Dyer, who just arrived from the Spurs bench, to De Ligt, the club's most consistent centre-back since the winter break? De Ligt is Bayern's designated boss at the back, and to leave him out in a game of this magnitude almost felt personal, another example of Tuchel's disregard for hierarchy within the team. While the club has been more defensively stable this season, it still doesn't quite explain why the lesser talented Dyer was picked ahead of De Ligt against Leverkusen. Tuchel's tactical inflexibility could be the contributing factor, as he prefers centre-backs who are either quick or good on the ball, areas where De Ligt does not particularly excel at. Of course, Tuchel can choose his own lineups free of scrutiny, as long as he wins, that is. But if results disappoint and important figures are left disgruntled, the club's patience tends to run very thin. One benefit of announcing the departure of Tuchel early is that it frees the club to pursue an ideal replacement like Alonso more aggressively. Bayern wouldn't be Bayern if they didn't feel they were in with a good chance to get their man. And now, there's an expectation that the underperforming players will step up, no longer able to hide behind the uncertainty surrounding the manager's future. As for Tuchel, the board hopes that he will focus on facilitating a happy ending to his time at the club, either by being more ruthless in his decisions or more accommodating of his team's wishes. While Tuchel is a great coach, I don't think he fits the style of Bayern Munich. With that said, he isn't the sole problem plaguing the club. The overarching problem could lie in the fact that, after over a decade of dominance, the club is rattled by the genuine pressure from Leverkusen, a real challenger to dethrone them as Bundesliga champions. It's also possible that the hunger and motivation within the team have diminished after winning all of those championships. The current outlook is certainly not a new phenomenon for Bayern. Low energy and confusion had affected their possession game well before Tuchel's arrival last year. It's just that things have gotten a lot worse under him. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more football news, stories, and insights. Also, don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a beat. And with that, we'll see you in the next video.